From the nation's capital, this is the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast with your host, Rob Snowhite.
Thank you for downloading the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Snowhite. This is Series 2, Episode 54. I interview author Paul Greenberg, author of American Catch and For Fish. Been reading over his books and thought this guy would make an awesome interview about the travels he's done to write these books and inspiration and his fishing. However, as I'm reading through American Catch, there's a whole section about the Pebble Mine. And at the time the book was written, Pebble Mine was going to get terminated. And now with the new presidential lack of environmental regulations, it may be coming back. So sit back. This is a short podcast. Paul didn't have a whole lot of time, so we try to get as much talking done as quickly as possible. Hopefully, with his busy schedule, I can get Paul on again. Maybe when he comes back next time to Washington, D.C. If you want to buy his books, it's paulgreenberg.org, paulgreenberg.org. It's available in several languages. You can also buy them on Amazon, iTunes, Barnes & Noble, etc. So enjoy this one, and no Pebble Mine. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the next book that Paul is writing, which we get a little sneak preview of. So the reason I wanted to interview you, I picked up For Fish and read that, and it's awesome. In fact, I bought it so I could doggy ear it, and these are all things that I end up talking about with my clients. People always, what do you talk about when you're on the water? I talk a lot about conservation. And then I picked up American Catch about a week ago at the library, and the third part is all about the Pebble Mine, undermined about the salmon. And I thought, great, we're done with the Pebble Mine. But not anymore. So I wanted to bring you on to tell the listeners, you've been there, you've testified on the Hill. Can you sort of go over, of course, I want everybody to pick up and buy the book, but can you talk about why this is such an important news topic again?
Okay. Do you want me to start right in, or how do you
go for it. I'll just sit back. I've got questions, but I'll let you do your thing.
Well, Pebble is like a giant metaphor for the fight between fisheries and industry, and that fight has been going on ever since Europeans hit the shores here. I was actually just writing a piece about dam construction on the East Coast. And, there are 4,000 dams in my home state of Connecticut, and we eradicated wild salmon throughout New England. And then we went and started eradicating salmon throughout the West Coast, so California, Oregon, Washington. There are still salmon in those states, but most of them are supported through stock supplementation, and they're basically on human life support. So really the only last place we've got where we've got really truly healthy runs of wild salmon is Alaska. And when I say healthy, I mean actually commercially viable, commercially valuable runs of salmon. I often think about what the conservationist and fisherman Carl Safina said. He said that we shouldn't have an Endangered Species Act, we should have an Abundant Species Act. So let's not just eliminate stuff down till we're saving the last 3 or 4 animals. Let's think about how we can create ecosystems or conserve ecosystems where abundance is the norm. So that's what we're talking about with Pebble Mine and with the Bristol Bay watershed. This is the largest sockeye salmon run in the world. Something like as many as 60 million fish can be in the system at any one time. It's incredibly valuable from a commercial point of view. I think it generates tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars if you amplify out what the multiplier effect is to both sportsmen and commercial fishermen and all their ancillary support industries. And the Pebble Mine itself is located in the headwaters of some of the best salmon rivers that feed into Bristol Bay. In particular, if I remember correctly, because it's been a little while since I've looked at the topic, but there are two main watersheds in the Bristol Bay area, the Kwijak and the Nishigak. And if Pebble Mine were to go ahead, it sits at the headwaters of both of those rivers. And so if there were a major failing of the tailings dam that they need to put in to make that dam possible, it could potentially affect both the Nishigak and the Kwijak watersheds. So it's a huge, huge deal. Is that more or less what you wanted me to do?
I wonder if I should have had the number. So, you just mentioned the tailings of it. From what I remember, it's going to be 1,000 feet wide, 1,000 feet high, and I don't remember how long the tailings would be. Tailings, for those who are listening, it's like the refuse, the leftovers. They take out the good stuff, they leave the bad.
Yeah, and it's important to note that so the primary object, the metals that they're trying to get out of Pebble Mine are copper and gold. And it's a very, very diffuse mine. It's what's called a sulfate mine. So as I think it was Rick Halford, who is at one point, I think, Speaker of the Senate, the state Senate in Alaska, said, if you were to describe this by what kind of mine, what kind of stuff is actually in it, you would call it a sulfur mine and not a copper or gold mine. What that means is that, if you were to comb through all of those, I think it's a 10 billion ton, if I'm correct. You might want to fact check me on that one, but I haven't been I haven't reported there in a while. But certainly all fact checked in American Catch. But if I recall correctly, it's a 10 billion ton mine from which I think 2 or 3 billion tons would be actual ore, and the rest of it would be tailings. And I don't remember the heights of the dam, but they would be earthen dams, and you would have to have a retaining lake that I think was 2,000 feet deep as the proposal went. And it's a highly active seismic area. So you're putting all of these tailings that are, have a great deal of sulfur in them, putting them behind earthen dams in an earthquake area. So, and then, when the Environmental Protection Agency was looking into this, their ruling was that if they were to go ahead with permitting, then the Pebble Partnership, at the time it was Anglo-American and I think Northern Dynasty, two major mining companies. If they'd gone ahead with the permitting, then the partnership would have to guarantee mitigation of tailings wastes in perpetuity. So, in other words, forever.
Right. You said it would require 24-hour supervision for, thousands of years.
Well, 24 hours, they don't really, as I recall, they didn't really stipulate what kind of supervision.
Right.
Because who's to say, you need somebody staring at the dam 24/7. What they did is, they did use the term in perpetuity. So, it's what's the oldest company on Earth, right? Maybe 1,000 years if you trace back the Dutch East India Company or something, or some old brewing company. So 1,000 years, do we really think 10,000 years from now there's going to be a responsible legal entity to the Pebble Partnership that's going to be able to deal with the mine failure if it happens? I don't think so. So it's a very concerning thing, and it's really just a metaphor also for a lot of things going on. I'm actually I just finished a PBS Frontline special that's going to air in April, and we went back to Alaska, and in the special there's a graphic of all the salmon streams in Alaska, and then it fades to an overlay of all the mining claims in Alaska. And surprise, they pretty much overlap. And so, if Pebble goes, there are so many outstanding claims in Alaska that you're really looking at an all-out conflict between salmon and mining if this goes forward.
And salmon cannot live with sulfuric acid in the water.
Well, it's difficult, right?
Yeah. I once made a cloud of sulfuric acid in chem lab in college and had to evacuate the entire floor. And that was just a couple of people. I mean, if that stuff, so you've been there. I mean, what does that amount of salmon look like to the naked eye?
It's really amazing. I mean, I've always gone around the 4th of July, which is, that's my birthday, and also the peak of the sockeye salmon commercial season. So when salmon come into the river, in the mouths of the river, they're what are called sea bright. They're still silvery, and they haven't started to make that metamorphosis into a spawning fish. So they don't have that bright red color. They're just silvery, and they're still in the sort of murky delta area. So you don't see that kind of amazing spawning moment that you would see once they get further upstream. That said, I was out with commercial guys, and we got what's being called corked. There were so many salmon in the net that the corks holding up the set net were sinking, and we were butting up against the end of the commercial opening. And they're very, very good with salmon management in Alaska. They open up the rivers for a certain number of hours at a time to fishing, and then they close it. And they do that so that you're preserving the genetic diversity in the river, because every pulse of salmon that comes into the river is slightly genetically different, might be heading towards a different rivulet that leads, a different part of the river. So anyway, when they close the opening, when they close the daily fishing, you have to make sure all your nets are out and all your fish are in the boat. And I remember we just got slammed by all these sockeye coming into the river, and we were just pulling like crazy to get all the fish in. And by the time we'd actually gotten the fish into the boat, it was a fairly large skiff, and we were up to our thighs in salmon. So, what's that look like? It looks like a lot of fish, and these are really high value fish. They're really delicious fish, and it's really quite a sight to see. It's worth going.
Now, that amount of fish currently, with all the farming and harvest, would it have looked the same, 1,000 years ago? That many fish, or would it have just been like? Well, you're acres.
You're delving into shifting baseline territory here. But you know what you should do? I assume this is a podcast, so you go online, so this will be online.
Uh-huh.
The University of Washington has some beautiful, beautiful footage that I believe is public domain of spawning sockeye. That's later into July, into August, and you can see it. But in any case, to your question, the standard fisheries management practices apply in Alaska, and when people go fishing commercially in this country, they try to achieve what's called maximum sustainable yield, or MSY. And when you're doing maximum sustainable yield, the theory is that if you leave a certain percentage in the water, often the number I hear often is 40% of the historical biomass in the water, that 40% will replenish and bring you back up to 100%, which you can then harvest again. So if they're doing their fisheries management right, they should have something similar to what was in Alaska right now. That said, there is a lot of commercial fishing pressure. There's also subsistence angling pressure. The one thing that Alaska really has going for it is there are hardly any dams. As I said before, Connecticut has 4,000 dams. There really is a lot of just good spawning areas still open up to salmon, which really isn't the case for most salmon country in the world. And then also water quality is quite good. Salmon really need really high oxygen, pure, clean water. There's logging in a lot of southeast Alaska, but not so much further up, although there is logging that does occur. But it's just night and day compared to, say, Oregon, where I counted salmon in the Coast Range and hardly saw any fish in the 80s when I was doing there. What I did see was a lot of clear cuts and a lot of dams.
So you saw that in the 80s?
In Oregon, yeah. So in Oregon, when I was a kid, or when I was in college, I took a year off, and part of that time I was working for the Student Conservation Association, and on Bureau Land Management land, I was doing steelhead and salmon surveys, and I saw one fish the entire time.
Wow. That was then. It's probably worse. now?
Well, it's hard to say. It goes up and down. I mean, I was not there during prime spawning time, and it might have been different had I been there, say, in the summer or the fall. But what was apparent then was just the way they were completely clear-cutting all the timber in Oregon. And it was really sad because, all the loggers would get in a twist and say, oh, we have to keep logging because it's our way of life, it's our jobs. But meanwhile, they were sending raw logs to Japan, and there were hardly any jobs aside from the cutting of the trees. The mills were starting to shut down because the Japanese didn't want cut timber. They wanted to cut it themselves. And then there was this ridiculous reg that they put in where, okay, no, America first. We have
Sounds familiar.
Right. We have to have, logs that are huge, that are cut in America. So they did this thing where they would cut one edge of the log off, just like one edge of the bark off, and that was considered milled in America, and then they'd export it to Japan.
Oh, of course.
So it was just, it was really brutal. And, as a volunteer with the Bureau of Land Management, which you might have seen recently, almost got dissolved last week. There was a bill introduced by, I think, a senator from Utah, where they were trying to basically dissolve the holdings of the Bureau of Land Management.
I've been on bad terms with Orrin Hatch for nearly 20 years now, lobbying in college against him. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it was. I don't think Hatch actually sponsored this particular piece of legislation. It might have actually started from the House.
Okay.
If you Google around, you'll find it. But we almost lost all those lands. Fortunately, the hunters and the fishermen went berserko and wrote tons of letters and stopped that bill from getting anywhere near a floor. So that was great. And I always think like the secret conservatives out there that are poised to, I think, put up a major fight against this administration are all the hunters and the fishermen, who, generally speaking, vote Republican. There are some, I don't know about yourself, but, certainly meet the sort of conservation-minded hunter or fisherman out there who votes Democratic. But there are a lot of, especially in the West, there are a lot of people who's basically, hands off my gun, I want to shoot my elk. But you start privatizing public lands and cutting off access to fishing and hunting, you're going to see a really serious revolt.
So as deja vu, now that this is, they're putting the legislation that possibly opening up the mine again, are you going to come back down to D.C. and speak to Supreme Court, Congress, senators, have to just do it all over again?
If I'm called to talk about Pebble Mine, I certainly will come down and talk to the people down there. I think I said in American Catch that fishermen are kind of like hidden moles, in that you find them in odd places. And I remember when I came down and talked at the Supreme Court, that was a session that was held to just kind of popularize and bring to everybody's mind what an amazing place Bristol Bay is. The person who helped organize that was Sandra Day O'Connor. And, she's, a Republican appointee, but she's a fisherman. And I think when she saw that this was something that was really, truly might happen, she got active about it and helped make that happen. So I think that, somebody, I think it was Tim Bristol, who was with Trout Unlimited and now has started this thing called Salmon State, but he's in Alaska. And he said, the conservation business, all victories are temporary and all defeats are permanent. And that's unfortunately the case with all environmental things. We always have to refight these same fights. But the good thing is you're always, it's not like you're defending some crook, who busted out of jail and you have to go down to jail and defend him again. You're defending this most incredibly beautiful, miraculous thing. And, it's a little bit like religion. I mean, sinners, people go to church, right? And they go to church again and again to go through the same problems. And if you believe in God and you believe in religion, sometimes you achieve an enlightenment. You achieve this feeling of grace. And so for me to go down and defend Pebble, it's a feeling of grace and an opportunity to express that grace to people who might not have been touched by it yet.
And I don't know if I'll ever get there, so I have to thank you for doing the work.
Well, you should
for myself and with my daughter. I mean, it's been on my list to get up there for a long time.
Well, if you want to go, I have a couple of people I could send you to. And certainly get up there. But in the meantime, what I think you should do is you should try and get as many people in the administration on your boat fishing and get them into a conversation. Offer to take their kids out, whatever.
I gave Trump Jr. my business card last weekend.
Oh, yeah. Great. Well, I'd love to come down and fish with you and talk about all these things. I was thinking, this article came to my mind, you could do, instead of draining the swamp, it's fishing the swamp.
Exactly. Have you ever seen the shad run down here?
I've heard of it, but I've not seen it. And I know, are they primarily American shad or hickory shad or gizzard shad? What do you got down there?
We have, the gizzard shad, which nobody wants. They're absolutely disgusting.
Right.
But mostly hickories. We're not getting down really deep enough from shore to get the Americans.
Yeah.
If you're out on the boats, you'll get more Americans, but you can get a hickory shad almost on every cast if you're doing it right. On a 5-weight, it's about as exhilarating as fly fishing gets.
When is that, April?
April to May. It's based on river temperatures. And again, that's a fishery that early last century was decimated. There were, I think, 11 fish processing stations up and down the Potomac. They just would go across the entire river with nets and just scoop out everything.
Yeah.
And now they're protected and they're coming back. Now you can't even take river herring. There's a moratorium on those now.
Yeah, same up here. Well, for now anyway, right? I would love to come down and fish the shad. I mean, I think, one of the so right now I'm working on a new book called The Omega Principle, and it's about omega-3 fatty acids. And one of the things I've been sort of toying with in the book is the fact that once upon a time, this country was so rich in food that had high levels of omega-3s. I mean, you take your shad or your herring or whatever. But we basically destroyed that and replaced it with food that's very high in omega-6, which if you follow your nutrition, things like corn and soy, things like that actually compete in the body for space on enzymes that can lead you down a path of inflammation if you're overly high in omega-6s. But if you have the right balance and you have more omega-3s in your system, that can lead you down the path to resolution. So we've actually made ourselves sicker potentially by shifting away from this amazing, once amazing wild food source and ruining our rivers and ruining those natural ecosystems that once fed us.
Mm-hmm. When do you think that book will be out for us?
That will be coming out in the summer of 2018. Tentatively, it's titled The Omega Principle. But I'm revising it now. But more in the more near term, PBS Frontline will be airing a special that I'm hosting. It's going to be called The Fish on My Plate, and it's sort of a journey in and out of wild and farmed and everything in between. And we do go to Alaska in the special. We go to lots of other places, so it's pretty fun little film, I think.
Excellent. All right. I had another question. So after reading the oyster chapter, so I'm only really been exposed to oysters down sort of Virginia area. I had some from Maine.
Yeah.
And that first slurp, I understood the merwa that you mentioned. I've never had a briny oyster like that before.
Yeah, it's a different experience.
If I hadn't read your book the week before, it would not have been such an interesting experience.
Yeah, well, certainly, yeah. I mean, we in land food we talk about terroir, right? The wine and the beef and so forth, tasting of the land. And merroir is this concept I was first introduced to by a guy named John Rowley, who is an oyster aficionado. And the idea is that every oyster tastes like the bay it's from, and that's why it's so fun to eat oysters, because, since there are more and more good oyster bars around, you can now order a dozen oysters where every oyster is from a different place. And it's just really, really fun to try and taste those differences. And you really can. I mean, one thing anyone can taste the difference is the difference between an East Coast oyster and a West Coast oyster. Have you tried any West Coast oysters before?
I have, but I probably didn't pay that much attention to it.
So next time you do, keep watermelony in your mind, and you'll realize that every West Coast oyster has a slightly watermelony taste that the East Coast don't have. And you're right, the southern oysters have a whole other taste entirely. I mean, they tend to be more brackishy, a little bigger. Some would call them flabby. I actually I kind of broke myself in on oysters, on southern oysters. I was first kind of exposed to oyster eating a year after the Gulf spill, the oil spill. I started doing research in Louisiana. And, I was saying, I think I said in an early article about it that New Orleans is one of the only places that a freelance journalist can sidle up to a bar, eat a dozen oysters, and afford to be able to say, when the bartender says another dozen, you can afford to say, you bet, because the oysters are so cheap down there. And so I really got to like southern oysters, but they are bigger. It's partially they're bigger often because they're just the water is more fertile and full of stuff for them to eat. And I guess also Southerners have gotten used to those big wild oysters, and that's sort of what it's all about down there.
The book I'm reading now discusses that they used to have oysters that were the size of dinner plates. Yep. Those are all long gone.
Are you reading Mark Kurlansky's book?
No, so I haven't read oyster. I've read cod.
Uh-huh.
I'm reading. I can't remember. It's got like a little butterfish. It's a British author. I don't eat seafood except for oysters and maybe some mussels.
You throw everything back?
Yeah, I was brought up with just weird eating habits. So I read all about the stuff I'm reading all about the salmon you write, but I'm not going to eat salmon. It's just what interests me.
Yeah. Well, as a kid, I wasn't a huge fish eater, but as I started to fish more and become more conscientious about it, I realized that kind of eating it was part of the experience. And actually, for this latest book, for this Omega book, I put myself on an all-fish diet for an entire year to see what would happen. And I did my blood work and all that kind of stuff. And it was like a big experiment on my body.
The opposite of supersize me.
Exactly, fishicize me.
Yeah.
So.
And then also reading about how the northern fish are slower and they don't move as much. They don't need the speed, so their muscle meat is whiter and flakier. And that brings me down to introduce snakeheads down here, which everyone loves to eat, and it's just white, soft, flaky meat.
Yep.
And I wonder if that's because they're just such a lazy fish.
Could be. I mean, it's basically there's two kind of muscles in fish. There's fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. And fast twitch muscles or red muscle fiber tends to be in fish that are real hard, steady swimmers, whereas slow twitch are for fish that tend to, just hang about and just need to do the occasional jerking of their head around to kind of grab something. So it's possible. I've actually eaten snakehead down there in Washington, and you're right, it is quite tasty.
Where did you eat it?
It's a friend of mine actually got some at a fish market and brought it in. So I was surprised to see that people were actually selling it. But are you finding them just everywhere in the rivers down there?
The bow hunters are decimating them a lot.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, it wasn't Bart Seaver's dinner that he did down here a couple years ago.
I know Barton Seaver.
Yeah, tell him we're old friends.
Oh, good. Yeah, I just talked to him actually the other day.
You tell him the Snowhite said hi. He'll be like, "What?"
Oh, all right, good. Yeah, he's in Maine now. But no, this wasn't Barton's dinner. This was just a friend of mine's found it in a fish market, and I was slightly kind of, Snakehead is a terrible name if you're thinking about trying to market something. So somebody really ought to come up with a different name for them. And the only other time actually I'd had snakehead was where their native was Vietnam, and there's this dish that they make in Vietnam called ca to, which is this sort of fish in a clay pot with a lot of brown sugar and black pepper. And it's pretty good. And the American version of it is to use kind of a nice white fillet, but Vietnam being Vietnam, people like to see the head on the fish. And so when you stick your spoon into it, it's like and the spoon comes up, it's like watching Alien, come out of the murk.
It's a pretty ferocious looking face on that thing.
Yeah, and to have that in your soup is a little bit off-putting. So that had been the previous time that I'd eaten it. So when my friend actually brought a nice white fillet of it, I was kind of shocked.
I've eaten them once. but I had nothing to refer it to because
you don't eat fish.
it was lost on me. It's just like I used to work I was a cheesemonger and we had the Iberico ham, and they're like, taste a piece, and I'm like, I wouldn't know the difference between this and like boar's head, honestly. Like, don't waste something that good on me.
That's very funny. That's very good. Hey, I should probably wrap this up.
Okay.
Soon.
Yeah. So, what can the listeners do to help prevent this? Call, write letters.
Yeah, I mean, the issue at hand with Pebble Mine is that the mine itself, the claim is on state land, which makes the federal involvement complicated. And what happened under the previous administration, there is a clause within the Clean Water Act called the 404C, which allows the federal government to get involved in permitting when the site in question is an area of national significance for shellfish beds or spawning areas. And so under the 404C clause, EPA had started an action under the Obama administration. Now, obviously, that could get stopped pretty cold. And I think, we need to be supporting the EPA in a really big way and to figure out how to keep its essential mission in place. Certainly, if you have a congressman that is engaged with these matters, or even if you don't, I think it's important to, in general, stress to your elected representatives that you want clean, healthy water, that you don't want the Clean Water Act in any way diminished under this administration, and that you see this as an essential obligation of government to keep our water clean and our air clean. So I think that message can be directed. You can mention the Pebble Mine, but this kind of thing is happening all over the United States potentially. The recent lifting of an Obama era order that prevented dumping of coal mining tailings into streams. That was just, I think, rescinded by the House and the Senate.
Lovely.
So I mean, that's just part. It's all a piece. It's all connected, and you start unraveling this thing. Whether you start unraveling in Alaska or West Virginia, eventually it's all going to trickle down, so to speak, and pretty soon your water's going to be dirty too. So it really should be a line past which we should not cross, and we really need to keep our water clean and fish full, and it will be good for our fish and it will be good for ourselves.
Absolutely. Where can we purchase your books online?
You can go to my website, paulgreenberg.org. That's PaulGreenberg.org, and that'll take you to there. There are links directly to Amazon, but you can just go to Amazon. Both For Fish and American Catch are available in paperback. They're also available in audiobook format. I'm told I can't bear to listen to them being read out loud because it makes me too, I don't know, for whatever. But I'm told the narrator is very good, and people seem to like the audiobook. You can also get it on both of them on Kindle and on Apple, on iTunes and so forth. So everywhere books are sold, as they say.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy person, so much appreciate this. And next time you're in D.C., don't be a stranger.
I will do. Keep on fishing, Rob, and get one of the Trumps out on your boat.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much.
Take care.
All right. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us for the Fly Fishing Consultant Podcast. For more information or to contact Rob, please go to www.robsnowhite.com.
And if you lack the strength of your own, honey, hold out your hands and take it from an old man.